Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, Minimum Wage Ordinances, Tools for Successful Implementation. My name is Melissa Gopnik. I work at Commonwealth, and we seem to have a lot of people have signed on, so we're going to get going this afternoon. So first, just a couple of logistics. We will be using the chat box a lot. We really want this to be an interactive hour, so we will be using the chat box. So let's take a moment to locate it. It should be on the upper upper right of your screen. If you don't see the box, there should be an orange arrow that you can click on to open up the box. Let's test to see if people are able to do it. And why don't you let us know what part of the country you're calling from and what you do, and enter that into this box that actually says questions, and let's see if we can get this working, the interactive component. You can also use the questions box if something's not working and you can't hear or see me. There we go. Ricardo from San Diego, Nathan from Berkeley, Gina from Missouri, pardon my Canadian accent. Elaine from Wyoming. We have Amy from Minnesota. Great. Well, great. Thank you all. Welcome to our, and Mike from Maine. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. So throughout the webinar, there will be moments where you'll see this box on the screen again, and that'll be an opportunity to prompt for questions. But also, at any point, if you have a question or are having technical difficulties, please feel free to send us a question, and we will either respond in the moment or as soon as we can. Now that we know a little bit about who's on the webinar on your end, we wanted to just introduce who will be speaking today. As I said, my name is Melissa Gopnik. I'm a Senior Vice President here at Commonwealth. Tanya, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Goldman. I'm on the job quality team here at the Center for Law and Social Policy.
Great. And Brian?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Walsh. I work for the City of Minneapolis, and I'm happy to be with you all this afternoon.
Great. Thank you. So we just want to spend a few moments talking a little bit about Commonwealth and CLASP, who are the sponsors of today's webinar. Commonwealth, where I work, is a national nonprofit mission-driven organization that's an innovation lab. And our mission is to strengthen the financial security and the financial opportunity of financial vulnerable people who live in this country. One of our key to our success is collaboration. And this webinar is a perfect example of this, as we're collaborating with Tanya and Brian to present this today. Over the last 3 years, we've been working with employers and regulators across the country to really think about and pilot different ways of amplifying the effect of minimum wage hikes to build the financial security of lower wage workers. And today's webinar, we will be talking a little bit about that, what we have learned over those 3 years. Tanya, do you want to talk about CLASP?
Sure, thanks. So CLASP is an anti-poverty organization. We have a couple of different teams that work on different issues to improve the lives of low-wage people, low-wage workers. And as part of that, our job quality team advocates for and conducts research and analysis on policies such as paid sick days, paid family and medical leave, and fair and predictable schedules. But we know that these laws really aren't going to help low-wage workers and all workers if they're not robustly implemented and enforced. So we also think that collaboration is really important and work with community and government partners, such as many of you on the webinar today, to promote effective implementation and enforcement of labor standards.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. And so as CLASP and Commonwealth has been doing this work over the last few years, we keep running into each other, and so we thought it would be a great opportunity to share all of what we have all learned over the last few years in doing this work, and that's why we got to today. Our agenda for today, sorry, I went too quickly there. We wanted to start by talking a little bit about the title of today's webinar, which was Tools for Successful Implementation, and what we meant by that and why we chose that title. For us, a successful implementation starts with a real partnership between regulators and business leaders and the businesses who are going to be impacted by the minimum wage hikes, so that the implementation can lead to both better outcomes for employers and employees, and ultimately in the long term for the whole community. Now, clearly, that's a kind of rosy way of looking at the world, and may seem too rosy to some of you. But over and over again, in every community that we have worked with, we have found people in all sectors, in the government sector, in private sector, in workers' rights, who share a kind of fundamental belief that people's lives and communities can be better off as a result of the minimum wage hike. They may all use different words to describe that, but in fact, at the root of what they all believe is that there is a better way, and we can find that better way together. So on this webinar today, we're going to be talking about tools for engagement and tools for compliance, because we think those are two key cornerstones of getting to a successful implementation. So our agenda for today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the minimum wage hikes themselves and the business challenges that businesses face, so that we can better understand the opportunity that a minimum wage hike can provide to businesses to address their business challenges. Brian will then talk about the tools he has used to engage with the business community and what he has found to be successful. And I will talk about some of the tools we have used in our pilots with businesses as well. And then Tanya will talk about tools for compliance. And please remember throughout, if you have a question, feel free to ask it of us. So first off, minimum wage hike. You all know this as well as I do, but wanted just to spend a minute talking about the amazing breadth of minimum wage hikes now across this country. The states in dark blue have all passed a minimum wage hike ordinance in the last 3 years. In some places, the whole state. In some places, only certain communities within those states. But now there are 26 states within which there have been minimum wage hike ordinances. So that means many, many employers and many, many employees have been impacted by them. And so we see this as an incredible opportunity to make sure that those ordinances get implemented in a way that they can live up to their promise of improving lives. So we're going to come to an interactive place here. We're going to ask two polls. The first poll is, what have you heard from the business community about the minimum wage hike? And you can answer many questions. You don't have to just pick one, so you can pick multiple options. What have you heard from the business community about the impact of minimum wage hikes? I'm going to take a few moments. Everyone can click on as many options as you would like. And let's see. Let me have the results, please. Great. So it looks like they're going to have to cut costs is the number one answer, but close behind that is needing to lay off workers. And a few people have said that that it might help them recruit workers having higher wages. Great. Well, why don't we ask a slightly different poll this time, which is, what have you heard, if anything, from business community about the business challenges that they face? Again, you can pick as many options as you would like. Just waiting for everyone to have a chance to click. And let's see if we can get the results, please. Recruiting new employees, so that comes up on both of them. Keeping employees and controlling costs, right? That costs become a big issue, especially for smaller businesses, in order to continue to be able to stay in business. So there is some overlap around costs and recruiting new employees, but what we would like to see is really how can we have total overlap between the responses in the first poll and the second poll. In other words, how can we make the connection crystal clear between the opportunity of a minimum wage hike to address some of the fundamental business challenges that people are having in this economy right now. And we want to make that connection clear in order to make them willing, if not enthusiastic, about the new ordinances. So I'm going to talk a little, oops, I'm being told that I need to click on something here. Here we go. Talk about, as we kind of found in the poll, all of the research agrees with all of what you have all said, that recruiting and productivity and absenteeism and turnover, which are all workplace performance issues, are some of the key challenges being faced by businesses right now, especially in the tight labor market. And so there's a great deal of research actually that talks about the causes of these business challenges. Because before we can get to helping business understand how the minimum wage hike can be a solution, it'd be helpful to learn a little bit about what causes this. And there are many causes, clearly, around changes in the economy and changes in the technology. But one of the central causes that research has found is around employees feeling financially insecure. So in one study, around 40% of employees, especially lower wage workers, spent a significant amount of time at the workplace thinking about their financial worries. And I'm sure if any of you on the call have had that experience of, having a moment of not sure how you're going to pay, for example, your child's college education, or for the summer camp that they want to go to, or even something as simple as new clothing for their going back to school time. That worry is hard to leave at the door. So that's a worry you bring in with you to the work. Another study found that lower wage workers who are feeling financially insecure take around twice as many absent days because they have to go and deal with whatever is causing their financial insecurity. So one of the major causes of many of these business challenges are employees being financially insecure. So then the next question becomes, how do we connect minimum wage hikes with addressing financial insecurity? And so I just want to quickly share 3 stats or statistics or facts that we have found over our work in this area that we think really demonstrate the link between minimum wage hikes and employees' financial security, and therefore to addressing people's business challenges. Okay. So first, there's a pretty direct link. We did a national survey of lower wage workers, only workers who make less than the median U.S. income. And we asked them, what would happen if your employer offered you tools to make you financially secure? And they pretty loudly said they would be more loyal to the company, and it would also improve their productivity. And so then the question becomes, what does an employee believe is a tool that would help them become more financially secure? And in our survey, we had a 2-way tie on this one, with 63% saying savings, tools that would help them save, and another 63%, as many overlaps, of course, saying that helping them manage their debt would be a key financial tool that an employer could offer that would help them feel more financially secure and therefore be more loyal and more productive in the workplace. And so we have focused our work over the last few years on savings and what can an employer do around to offer a benefit that would help their employees save. So one more chat this time, not a poll. How much money do you think does someone need to have in their savings account in order to help them worry less about paying their everyday expenses? You can think about yourself, think about your family. What do you think that looks like? What's the dollar amount you would want in a savings account to make you worry less and therefore feel more financially secure? I got one response at 500, 2,000, 3,000. A couple more minutes. A couple more people want to weigh in on this question. Do we want salary? Yep, that's a rule of thumb lots of people use. 6 months of spending, another rule of thumb that many people use. 5,000, absolutely. Right, so all over the map. What you may be surprised to hear is that it's really not that high. Our work and work by the Urban Institute has found that $400 in savings can have a significant impact on people's sense of worry about whether they can meet their everyday expenses. So the old kind of rules of thumb of 3 months of spending or 3 months of income really is probably much higher than it needs to be to get this kind of psychological impact around having emergency savings. And so we believe, and we have proven through our work, that a moment of a raise, even if it's a small raise, which some of the minimum wage hikes are, can be a wonderful opportunity to help people to start building that savings. Brand new Federal Reserve data that just came out a couple of weeks ago has found that 40% of Americans don't have $400 in their savings account. That's where this $400 kind of benchmark has come from. So there's a real challenge. Kind of, some people have called it almost a crisis around emergency savings, with 40% of the country not able to use cash to pay for a $400 unforeseen expense. So we ask employees, when you get a raise, what do you want to do with that raise, right? And what we find, the dark blue is what in fact they did do, and the light blue is what they wanted to do. And you can see there's a gap between intention and action, which I know we can all relate to in various parts of our lives, that we often have great intentions and don't act on them. And so this is an example of that, right? People want to save and pay off debt, but in fact, they end up frittering it away, one might say, on everyday expenses. And so we think it's a huge opportunity for employers to help their employees, reach what they want to be doing, which is to save the money by providing them financial tools. And that a raise is the perfect time to do that. And we think there's an opportunity for regulators to talk with employees about this opportunity in that way, that it will help them to meet their business challenges if they were able to offer at the same time as the minimum wage hike tools that will help their employees build their financial security. In the next section, we're going to actually talk about some very specific examples of tools that Brian will talk about, tools he has used to engage with the business community, and then I'll talk a little bit about tools that we have piloted with businesses to help them understand this opportunity in this way and that you can use in your work. And then Tanya will talk about tools for compliance. I'm going to take a pause here. Does anyone have any questions about any of this? And the webinar will be available recorded afterwards, as well a bunch of handouts. You should see a thing that says handouts, and we have a bunch of handouts there. Let's just give a pause. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to talk about his experience with tools for engagement.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And again, my name is Brian Walsh. I work in the Labor Standards Enforcement Division of the City of Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights. So I'm going to speak today about the experience here in Minneapolis of actually implementing and enforcing new minimum wage hikes. I'm going to start just by naming a couple of things and acknowledging that when I think about business and business interests and business community and how to get information into their hands and how to build buy-in and awareness, I need to be in conversation with these stakeholders. And there's some really basic dynamics here that are often at play, which is that oftentimes I am, and the way that they're used to business owners, individual business owners are used to interacting with the city or government agencies. The government tells them what to do and they get upset about that. That's a very simplistic kind of summary of the dynamic, but that is sort of the reality oftentimes. So to even start to be in this more long-term and broader conversation with them, it is important to just kind of name that dynamic and understand where these business owners are coming from and what it is that they're concerned about, and start to actually listen and acknowledge those things before I start to give them new or different information, or try to turn what is sort of a yelling past one another into a genuine conversation. So the first thing also that I want to note is that I believe that this is really good public policy, and I don't think any city regulator or someone working in enforcement can do their job well if they don't believe that this is good public policy, raises in the minimum wage. And I think it's important that business community understands that that's the perspective that I'm coming to the work with. It's equally important for me to understand that I believe those things really in the aggregate and more in the long term, that I believe that these are investments in the workforce that will, can and will pay dividends in the longer term and in the aggregate, that we all do better when we all do better. A lot of business owners that I interact with are really reacting and talking to me based on their own individual interests and their own individual fears about what might happen to their business right now. And so that sometimes is the disconnect. And I think it's important for me oftentimes to pause and actually listen and acknowledge that some of those fears may be completely legitimate. Take the restaurant industry, for example. I'm hearing from a lot of restaurant owners right now as we careen towards a minimum wage increase on July 1st here in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's an industry with high concentrations of low wage work. And a lot of business owners, restaurant owners, are concerned with how this is going to change their business model and change their entire industry, and will they adapt in time or at all, such that they will see the benefits that Melissa and others such as myself are trying to suggest. So getting sort of listening and getting through some of that and past some of that, and accepting that I'm not always going to be the most popular guy in the room when I'm talking to business community, and being perfectly okay with that is sort of step one and almost a prerequisite to any of this work at all. But once we are in that space and are understanding the dynamics and where we're situated in relation to the business owners, and understanding that they are, once you get there, they are, I believe that they are oftentimes aware that there may be real positives for their businesses. Many of the things, again, that Melissa was talking about, but they're not necessarily going to bring that, they're not going to necessarily say that out loud to me. And again, that's okay. I don't need to be the most popular one in the room when I'm speaking to business community. And they don't need to acknowledge that there is upside here and opportunity for them. They don't need to acknowledge that to me every time, that I can still equip them with information that I know will be valuable to them and may help win their buy-in, even if they don't admit it to me. The types of tactics that we've used here in the city of Minneapolis are really on the scale of broad and deep communication, whereas in the last several years, I've done a lot of work in sick and safe time ordinance and in minimum wage ordinance. Compared to sick and safe time, minimum wage is a concept that is very much known and already exists. And business owners, relatively speaking, already can get their heads around what it is and how to do it in a really literal sense. They're already paying a minimum wage, and now it's going up. Whereas sick and safe time is relatively new and complicated to a lot of business owners. So my aim when communicating and building awareness around a minimum wage increase is really to communicate broadly, because this impacts huge numbers of businesses and huge numbers of workers. And so I want to get out broad public awareness, and so that influences the type of tactics that I emphasize. As you see on your screen, the way that I think about the different outreach tactics and the strategies that we've used here at the city are divided into three categories: 1, owned media; 2, paid media; and 3, earned media. The first one, owned media, when I talk about that, I'm referring to things like our website. And you can see on your screen the screenshot of our minimum wage website. We very intentionally built a sort of a higher profile web page dedicated solely to the minimum wage, to direct traffic, direct people to where they can get information and resources. And this is the kind of place that tools such as those developed by our partners on the webinar today can fit in really, really, really well. Other things that are really important and that you don't want to forget about that I know have been good here in Minneapolis are things like email newsletters, not only for my division or my department, but also elected officials are oftentimes looking for material or content to put in their communications to constituents. They're oftentimes sort of the mouthpiece of the government, either the agency or the city as a whole, and our constituents and businesses are looking to them for information. They're not necessarily used to coming to a particular department. Also, neighborhood organizations and small business and medium and large business organizations oftentimes have constituencies. They have monthly newsletters and other communications that they're looking oftentimes for content. They have a distribution list, and so I've done things like build little toolkits and little graphics and blurbs that make it really easy for those types of organizations to slip right into their existing communications, such as monthly newsletters. The other thing is email blasts that we have. You can subscribe to communication directly on the website. You can subscribe to communication directly from the department. So that email, again, that's owned. It doesn't cost anything. And these all, they all communicate relatively broadly because these are fairly large subscription or subscriber lists or email lists. Social media, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but that is another really, really big one. Some things that I've looked at more recently are a robocall. We did that last summer. We piloted that. It's usually used for public emergency, or even snow emergency situations, but we use that to send a really short robocall to literally every business in the city of Minneapolis. I don't know how happy they were about it, but they understood and received the information in many cases. We also have an electronic billboard that the city has access to. That's something that we're doing this summer. And even more recently, texting. I'm trying to figure out how to migrate more information onto both social media and communicating through text. The next category of communication and tactics is the paid media. And so the big buckets in that category are what you see there on the slide is a graphic that we put on social media. I think this one was on Facebook. And for about $1,000 in paid Facebook boosts, we reached more than 65,000 people and had more than 12,000 actually click on a short video that we created. It was a little slideshow, an animated slideshow that's really simple to make and actually looks pretty good. And for about $1,000, again, we reached a huge number of screens and of people. I think that is, when you're going as broad as minimum wage, and that's the aim, that's something that you definitely, I would recommend. It has worked well here in the city of Minneapolis. Another one is radio. Both radio visits to community radio shows to sit down with the host and talk through what's going on, but also short spots, paid advertising on radio. Again, for about 1,000, somewhere in that neighborhood, you can get a series of paid advertising spots on community radio, and that can really reach a lot of ears really, really quickly for relatively little effort compared to going to sort of town hall to town hall, if you will. The last bucket of media is the earned media. And this one, I just want to pause, and I'll stop here after I get through earned media. But I think that this one cannot be emphasized enough, that this is absolutely critical when you're talking about both raising awareness, but actually getting people to not only know that it exists, but believe that it's real. The earned media is absolutely critical. A lot of folks on the call are familiar with the concept of co-enforcement, and this is an example of where working closely with our community partners through our own news releases, but actually then our community partners being able to say things in a way and tell the stories of individual workers in ways that I can't as a government entity, that really grab the attention and grab headlines in ways that are really, really important. I would say that this was a article in the Minneapolis Star Tribune. It's our major newspaper here in town, and I would say that this one article that resulted from one particular investigation did more to raise awareness and to build sort of a realization that this will actually be enforced. And so I think that this one article did more for both of those things than all of the other communications tactics that I spent time on put together. So those really are, again, owned media, paid media, and earned media are the way that I divide it up and organize my communication and outreach. And I think that there is real value in the types of information tools that, Melissa, that you referred to. And I think that information can be integrated into all of the tactics that I've described today.
Thank you, Brian, and that was a great segue. I can take a pause here if anyone has questions, but I'm going to kind of go and talk a little bit about other tools, as Brian mentioned, that you can incorporate into this media outreach strategy that specifically address how do the minimum wage hikes, how can they really help businesses with the business challenges they're facing, those of recruiting and those workplace performance. So everything I'm going to be talking about is in the handouts as well. So if you look on the upper right of your screen, you should see a little thing that says handouts. So there are 5 listed, and 3 of those, I believe, are from Commonwealth. But we really see 3 things we have used and have found to be successful. One are fact sheets, so that talk about the connections. So basically the first part of this presentation, and we have a brief that talks about those statistics and many others. If you have statistics that are specific to your community, that can be helpful, especially around kind of the tight labor market and how it's important to keep the workers that you have, and that having the minimum wage hike, implementing it in the right way can definitely help with that. We also have had some success with calculators. So this is an example of a calculator that's actually an Excel spreadsheet, but can also be in a Google Sheet, that helps people kind of have a longer term time horizon. You know, oftentimes if you say to someone, you know, you're getting an extra $1 an hour, people go, well, you know, that's nothing. I remember one focus group we did, and someone said, well, you know, the cost of soy sauce has gone up more than that, so that's not going to make any difference to me. But there's a lot of research that shows that if you talk about it in terms of longer term, like per week or per year, people will automatically think about longer term goals that they have. So if you talk about $1 an hour, they'll think, oh, well, that's nothing. What do I do in an hour? But if you talk about $200 in a month or $2,600 in a year, that makes them feel like it's something that might in fact be something that they can do something different with and not just use for day-to-day expenses. Another thing you can share is kind of best practices around how people can build employee financial security at the time of a raise. And many of the handouts talk about this, around using simple and clear messaging and providing people easy opportunities to save. So, for example, here is a messaging recommendation. Some have talked about how do you make a small raise seem big, making them about the here and the now. So, for example, here is an example of a flyer that really helps people understand how the raise can help and how if you save a piece of that, how that can build out really quickly. Here's an example of a split deposit form. So very kind of simple, but we know from our work that people who automatically split their deposit are much, much more likely, significantly so, statistically speaking, than people who try and do it manually. So the more that employers can get people to split their deposit, the more likely they are to save, and the more likely, therefore, they are likely to feel more financially secure. And here's an example of a poster that a partner we worked with in California used that really helped them understand the connection between the raise and the goals, that an employer used this with their employees. Any questions about any of that? I mean, the one other thing that I realizing now is I didn't have a slide for was employers can help connect their employees to bank accounts. We may all take it for granted that people have bank accounts, but we've now done 2 or 3 national surveys, and they have all found that around 40% of lower wage workers and minimum wage workers don't have a savings account. They may have a checking account for their direct deposit, but they don't have savings accounts. So ways that an employer can connect people to savings accounts is definitely a first step in getting people to save. And these are all resources we've tried and used with employers, and so if you can provide them to them, that will make it easier for them to kind of successfully implement the minimum wage hike in the workplace. I'm going to now pass it on to Tanya to talk about the other side, which is tools for compliance. Tanya.
Great. Thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Brian. So in addition to these great outreach and engagement strategies with business, from our perspective at CLASP, minimum wage increases are also a really good time to think about your enforcement strategies or your tools for compliance, because as you know, workers aren't going to benefit from the minimum wage hikes if they're not receiving the minimum wage in the first place. So we want to think about what are our enforcement strategies so we make sure workers are benefiting from these increases, but also that businesses are benefiting and that they're not being undercut by any other businesses who aren't playing by the same rules. So today I want to touch on 3 main points. The first is just that work is changing. I'm going to talk a little bit about changes in the workplace and how we should think about if that changes the way we do enforcement. The second is I want to talk about the growth of misclassification and its effect on workers and employers, again, because workers who are misclassified are not going to benefit from increases in the minimum wage. And third, provide a very brief overview on strategic enforcement and why we can use that to help tackle some of these problems of misclassification and labor standards violations. So, as many of you who work in enforcement agencies on the webinar know, how well you can perform in delivering protections for workers will really depend on if you're sort of keeping pace with changes in the economy and how those are affecting workers and their workplaces. There have been a lot of changes in many industries in the economy in the past few decades, and we've seen the emergence of a lot of new business models as well, which have changed the nature of employment relationships. For those of you who work directly with workers or go into work sites on the ground, you are probably well aware that employment no longer looks like sort of a traditional company that directly hires and employs all of its workers, and they sort of all work at one work site, right? What we see instead now is a variety of business models that include a lot of subcontracting. They may include temp agencies, labor brokers. There may be franchising or licensing or other different types of business models that are emerging in many, many different industries. And this can create a lot of problems for workers. So as you have increased subcontracting in an industry, you have a lot of layers between sort of the main business and all of the workers who are performing the work. And as you move down in those layers, what you'll find is that each entity has slimmer profit margins. They may have increased labor costs, and therefore they also have increased incentive to cut corners. And labor costs are often the first place, or maybe the only place they're able to shave expenses to remain competitive, which often comes at the cost of compliance with labor standards. So I included a picture here to talk a little bit about the janitorial industry as an example of what I'm talking about changes in the workplace. So before the 1970s, a building owner likely contracted directly with janitors who cleaned the building that they owned. And they probably hired them and trained them and supervised them. And when a janitor showed up for work, they knew who they worked for. Their employer may have even been located in the same physical place where their work was done, and they knew where their paycheck was coming from. And so that led to a certain type of enforcement model that made sense. But now we know that many janitors work in highly subcontracted industries, and they may have very little information about who they actually work for or all of the different entities involved in their employment. You could see a lot of different layers of subcontractors between the people doing the work and the building ownership. And in those layers, you might find that a lot of the subcontractors are undercapitalized and therefore have incentives to misclassify their workers, not just to cut costs such as not paying minimum wage and overtime, but this also means they may not be paying taxes or carrying workers' comp in addition to other expenses or rights that those workers are owed. This is not unique to the janitorial industry. Brian talked a little bit about the restaurant industry, but we're also seeing changes in many, many industries, including retail and construction, and I'm sure you can think of others. So we know that at the bottom of these highly subcontracted industries, there are going to be a lot of labor violations. But unfortunately, this is where workers may not actually be coming forward and complaining about their working conditions to an enforcement agency. This could be for a variety of reasons. One might be immigration status, maybe a worker is undocumented, maybe they think that this is a perceived barrier to coming to an enforcement agency, or maybe they have other fears about retaliation. Even when workers do come forward, we also know that they may lack a lot of the critical information that we need to investigate. So workers might not even know exactly who they work for or all the entities involved in their employment. So, we're moving forward. We know that changes in the nature of work also lead to increasing misclassification. And this is a critical issue to address for many reasons. I've named a couple of them. Employers who misclassify employees as independent contractors really aren't complying with our very most basic labor standards, including paying a minimum wage and overtime. And we know that these are workers who will not benefit from increases in the minimum wage. So this is a good time to be thinking about how to tackle misclassification. This is just a little diagram. Before I was at CLASP, I was at the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division that we came up with to think about misclassification and when workers are employees or independent contractors. But we know that for workers, this is a really big deal to them, not just around minimum wage and overtime, as I've mentioned, but it could impact their payroll taxes, their Social Security, their unemployment insurance, their workers' comp. It also has significant ramifications for workers in terms of the protections they're entitled to. They have to be employees to be protected from potentially discrimination or harassment in the workplace. And then again, we know that many workers may not even realize they're being misclassified or may be afraid to come forward if they're being misclassified. I also want to note, particularly we're talking about business outreach, that misclassification is a problem for employers. It's not just specific to employees. And it's a problem that we see grow once it takes root in an industry. And this is because it's really hard for employers who are playing by the rules to compete with other employers. They're just going to be at a competitive disadvantage for employers who are not following the same laws. I'll give you a quick example from the construction industry. There's one study that estimates that about 30% of construction workers in the South are now misclassified as independent contractors. If you think about construction as an industry with very high workers' comp premiums, so for those companies that are properly classifying their workforce, it's going to be very hard for them to bid on contracts and be competitive against companies that aren't accruing the same costs in their employment relationships. So a couple other just quick examples about the scope of the problem for workers and critical wages that they've earned, but they're not getting paid. There's a 2008 survey that found that more than a quarter of the workers who were surveyed were not paid the minimum wage. And of those workers who had worked overtime hours, 3/4 of them were not being paid their overtime rates, and the underpayment that these workers were suffering was not trivial. It was a significant amount, particularly for low-wage workers. And then more recently, in 2017, the Economic Policy Institute did an analysis of 10 states where they found that 2.4 million workers were being paid less than their state's minimum wage, amounting to over $8 billion in lost wages annually. And they estimated that if those numbers were representative of the entire country, it would suggest that workers are losing over $15 billion a year in wages. And one thing I found really interesting is they noted in this study that that's actually greater than the total value of property crimes committed in the U.S. each year, including robberies, burglaries, larceny, and motor vehicle theft. So I give you a couple of those examples just to note how critical minimum wage hikes are. Of course, we know that workers need this money, but we also know that these wage and hour laws are not going to be effective, and they're not going to be serving their intended purpose for particularly low-wage workers if they're not implemented and really robustly enforced. Okay, so that brings us to the need for strategic enforcement. So given what I've laid out as what I view as the sort of scope and breadth of the problem we're facing right now with labor standards violations, I want to talk a little bit about how do we tackle this problem and make sure that employers and working people are benefiting from these laws. So I don't have to tell anybody on this call, I'm sure, that agencies will never have enough resources to deal with all workplace violations. And I really firmly believe also that investigators are not going to be able to improve compliance by trying to go visit one employer at a time, or even by just exclusively remedying violations that have already happened. What we really want agencies to start thinking about is how do we not just sort of find back wages after a violation has happened, but think about how we can improve compliance industry-wide, how we can make sort of systemic changes in the industry. So I know that many agencies respond for a variety of reasons, and maybe some of them are statutory, by responding exclusively to complaints, sort of individual complaints that come in, or they operate on a first-in, first-out system for complaints. But as we've been talking about in the past few minutes, this kind of complaint-driven approach is really going to end up leaving behind some of the most vulnerable workers. Sometimes the worst violations are going to be happening, particularly in these highly subcontracted industries where workers are not coming forward to complain about the violations that are occurring. So this really highlights the need for a different approach to enforcement, which I'll give credit to my former boss, David Wiles, really coined the term strategic enforcement, but I know many folks are using different components of strategic enforcement around the country. So here on this slide are about a couple of different key elements of strategic enforcement, but overall what it really means is it's about using your limited resources in a way that furthers your mission of promoting compliance with the law. So this has a couple of strategies that different agencies can play with. I think everybody has very different resources and statutory abilities and authorities. So it's really something that different agencies can experiment with and adapt as necessary. Overall, the idea is just that you want to be really strategic about where and how you're using your limited resources so that you can prioritize your enforcement efforts to where you think the problems are largest, and also where you think workers are not necessarily going to come forward and complain, and also thinking about where you can work with partners and think about having a real impact on industry-wide compliance. So I've laid out a couple of examples of what you might do to start engaging in strategic enforcement, and I'll talk about the first two in a little more detail, and then strategic outreach and communications, which Brian really covered nicely. So if you want to think about identifying enforcement priorities and conducting proactive investigations, the idea again being that you're going to reach some of those workers who might not be coming to you, here are a couple of questions you might be able to ask yourself and work with partners in thinking about, which is, first, where does the data and evidence show that wage violations are most likely to occur? You could think about this in terms of where do emerging business models lend themselves to such violations. So again, we have highly subcontracted industries might be an example of this, like janitorial franchising. hospitality or construction or restaurants, as Brian mentioned. Another question to ask is, where might vulnerable workers be reluctant to exercise their rights? So in your own jurisdiction, that could include thinking about, do you have significant numbers of workers who are immigrants, who are undocumented, maybe some who work in very isolated environments where they're less likely to have access to information about their rights or talk to other workers about their rights. That might be industries like home care or, again, janitorial franchising. So this slide has a very non-comprehensive diagram of what the janitorial industry might look like for a worker in a case that you're investigating a wage violation. Again, there'd be multiple layers of subcontracting, which could lead to the wage violations. And the janitor may work sort of in off hours. They may work in locked office buildings. They may work overnight. So it can make it's a little more challenging and different to investigate and for them to talk to other workers. So when you're thinking about advocating on behalf of this worker or investigating and resolving a complaint, you might think a little bit about where you can have the biggest impact in changing behavior, both through the investigation and the settlement. So, for example, if you resolve the wage violation at the bottom level here, where the subcontractor or the unit franchisee is based, what might happen? So one thing is that the franchisee might not be able to pay it. They might just go out of business or declare bankruptcy, change their name, and come back and start up again as a new franchisee, right? So, or maybe they just are so undercapitalized, as I mentioned, that they can't even afford to pay their janitors the minimum wage. They're running basically a business model that doesn't work. So just finding a remedy for that one janitor is really not going to change behavior overall. It's not going to change the way the industry is operating. So as an agency, as a workers' rights organization, can we think about ways or opportunities to sort of move up the chain and look at, are there other entities that might be employers also of this janitor? Are there other entities that might be joint employers of this janitor? Are there other entities that have more control over the situation? Is there a way we can figure out through our investigation what is driving the non-compliance and find a way to try and remedy that through the settlement process? And figure out if there are any other things that we can do in the settlement or resolution that will help with future compliance. And the other thing to think about in the resolution process is not just, it's not specific, of course, to the janitorial industry, but are there systemic wage violations that are taking place that you can remedy more holistically? So particularly around minimum wage hikes, if, say, a worker comes to you and they're not getting paid because the payroll system they're paid through hasn't updated to the new amount, can you as an agency resolve that for all of the workers who are paid using that payroll system, because they're all going to suffer from the same violation? And can you require changes to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future? So I'm going to finish up with strategic outreach and communications as another form of how we can engage in strategic enforcement and help with compliance. So Brian talked about this already, so I'll be pretty brief. But it really is important to sort of highlight the work that you're doing and make sure employers and workers know about it. So press releases are one technique to do this, and then maybe they get picked up and put into news stories. So here we have an example from California. And press releases can really serve as an effective deterrent for other employers if they're not complying with the law, but also can just provide them valuable information about what their legal responsibilities are. It can also provide workers information about their rights. So if a worker reads this story, they might say, oh, that's the kind of work I do. Maybe I should look at how I'm being paid as well. And then in the bottom right here, I have another little clip from the US DOL Wage and Hour website. And this is really about using your strategic outreach and communications to tell a story about the work you're doing and why it matters. So this example comes from the average back wages recovered per worker, which was over $1,000, and really putting that in human terms of what does that mean to a low-wage worker. It might mean an additional 5 weeks of food that they can pay for, a month of rent, 3 months of utilities, or over 7 weeks of childcare. So it's as part of your outreach and communications, it is about those stories and placing those stories, but also about placing the story in a context that people really understand the importance of the work that you're doing. So I know that was a pretty cursory overview of strategic enforcement, so we have a couple of resources we've developed with the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers. We've partnered with them on these, and 2 of them are attached as handouts, the retaliation brief and the introduction to strategic enforcement. And I've also included a link here if you want to access some of our other materials. And I'll ask at this point if there are any questions and then turn it back over to Melissa.
Great, thank you, Tanya. Any questions at this point? Not seeing anything come through. Tanya and I are both more than happy to have individual conversations with anyone who, if you have specific questions about wanting specific advice or someone to talk things through with that is specific to your community, we'd be happy to check in with you individually. Right after this webinar, you will be getting an email that asks you to answer 2 quick questions so we can know if this webinar was helpful and how we could make it better. There's also an opportunity there to give us your name and email, and we will reach out to you soon after. You'll also be getting a copy of the webinar recorded if you have colleagues you'd like to share it with, and that should be coming your way tomorrow at the latest. With that, I will end this webinar, and thank you all for your attention and participation. Have a great rest of the afternoon.